The soft glow of a single candle flickered on the otherwise empty dining table. Helen Parker, a frail but dignified woman in her late 70s, sat quietly in her modest living room. A store-bought chocolate cupcake stood in the center of a small plate, serving as her makeshift birthday cake. She had carefully placed the single candle herself, one for hope, not for age. Outside, the rain pattered steadily against the windows, mirroring the somber rhythm of her heart. Her 4 children, Michael, Laura, Sarah, and David, had once been her pride and joy. But as the years passed, their visits became fewer, their calls sporadic, and their concern non-existent. The excuses were always the same. "I'm busy with work, Mom," or "The kids are keeping us so occupied." They had their own lives now, leaving Helen to fend for herself. Still, she harbored no resentment. She remembered rocking them to sleep, patching up skinned knees, and cheering at their school plays. Love, after all, didn't keep a tally. But as she lit the candle and sang a muted "Happy Birthday" to herself, she couldn't help but wonder how things had come to this. Just as she blew out the candle and made her silent wish, a sharp knock at the door startled her. Her heart skipped. It was past 8 p.m., and visitors were unheard of in her quiet, sleepy neighborhood. She hesitated, the years of living alone instilling a sense of caution. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "Just someone who needs a little shelter from the rain," a man replied, his tone soft and almost apologetic. Helen peeked through the peephole to see a tall, drenched man standing on her porch. He appeared to be in his early 30s, wearing a worn leather jacket and carrying a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Something about him didn't seem threatening. In fact, his eyes, kind and tired, reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. Against her better judgment, she opened the door slightly, leaving the chain latch secured. "It's not safe to let strangers in," she said cautiously. "I understand, ma'am," he replied with a small smile. "I was just hoping for a place to dry off for a moment. My car broke down a few blocks away, and the storm caught me off guard." Helen hesitated, her instincts warring with her sense of compassion. Finally, she unlatched the door and opened it fully. "Come in before you catch your death out there." The man stepped inside, dripping water onto the welcome mat. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "I'm Daniel, by the way." "Helen," she replied, motioning toward a chair. "Sit down and I'll get you a towel." As Daniel settled into the chair, his gaze wandered around the room. It was small, but filled with warmth. Knitted throws on the couch, family portraits on the mantel, and the faint aroma of lavender from a nearby diffuser. When Helen returned with a towel, he noticed the extinguished candle and the cupcake on the table. "Celebrating something?" he asked casually, patting his damp hair. Helen chuckled dryly. "If you can call it that. It's my birthday." Daniel's face softened. "Happy birthday, Helen. I'm sorry I interrupted your celebration." She waved him off. "Hardly a celebration," she said, her voice carrying a note of bitterness she hadn't intended. "It's just me this year." Daniel's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward. "That doesn't seem right. Someone like you shouldn't be alone on their birthday." The sincerity in his words caught her off guard. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. They spent the next hour talking, first about trivial things, then about life. Helen found herself sharing memories, regrets, and stories she hadn't spoken aloud in years. By the time Daniel left, the storm had passed, and so had the emptiness that had been gnawing at her all evening. But as she watched him disappear down the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was only the beginning of something much larger. She had no idea how right she was. The days following Helen's birthday felt different, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. Daniel had left an impression on her, not just because of his unexpected kindness, but because of how intently he listened. He hadn't judged her loneliness or offered hollow platitudes. Instead, he had simply been present, and that was something she hadn't experienced in years. 2 days later, Daniel returned. This time, he carried a small bouquet of daisies in one hand and a toolbox in the other. "Good morning, Helen," he greeted with a smile. "I realized I forgot to properly thank you for letting me dry off the other night. I hope these will brighten your day." Helen, caught off guard, took the flowers and inhaled their sweet aroma. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Maybe not," Daniel replied, "but I wanted to. And I noticed your gate was squeaking pretty loudly when I left the other night. Thought I'd fix it for you, if that's all right." Before Helen could protest, Daniel was already outside, inspecting the rusted hinges of her gate. She watched him work from the window, a mixture of gratitude and confusion swirling inside her. Why would a stranger go out of his way to help her? And yet, she couldn't deny how comforting his presence was. Over the following weeks, Daniel became a regular visitor. He stopped by to help with odd jobs around the house, tightening loose cabinet handles, fixing a leaky faucet, even replacing a few flickering light bulbs Helen had learned to live with. Each time, he brought something small: a loaf of freshly baked bread, a book he thought she'd enjoy, or a bag of oranges from a local market. As they spent more time together, Helen learned bits and pieces about Daniel's life. He had grown up in foster care, bouncing from home to home until he aged out of the system. Despite the challenges, he had carved out a modest life for himself, working as a freelance mechanic and handyman. "I've learned to appreciate the small things," he told her one afternoon as they sipped tea in her living room. "Acts of kindness go a long way, especially when you've been on the receiving end of so little of it." Helen felt a pang in her chest. His words echoed her own silent struggle, the yearning for connection, for someone to notice her. As their bond deepened, Helen began to open up about her children. She told Daniel about Michael, the ambitious lawyer who rarely called; about Laura, who lived just 20 minutes away, but always seemed too busy to visit; about Sarah, whose social media posts revealed a vibrant life that Helen was never invited into; and about David, her youngest, who had stopped returning her calls altogether. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression a mix of empathy and quiet anger. "You don't deserve that, Helen," he said firmly. "You've given them everything, and they've forgotten what that means." Helen shook her head. "They're not bad people, Daniel. They're just, preoccupied. It's the way the world is now, I suppose." But Daniel didn't seem convinced. One chilly Saturday morning, as they worked together to plant daffodil bulbs in the garden, Daniel spoke up. "Do they know what they're missing?" he asked, his tone pointed. Helen paused, her hands covered in soil. "What do you mean?" "They're missing you, Helen. Your kindness, your wisdom, your love. Do they even realize what it would be like to lose you?" The question struck a nerve, and Helen avoided his gaze. "It's not my place to force them to care," she said softly. Daniel didn't press further, but his words lingered in her mind long after he had gone. One evening, as Helen sat alone with her thoughts, she decided to write letters to her children. She poured her heart onto the pages, memories of their childhood, her pride in their accomplishments, and her sorrow at the growing distance between them. But when she finished, she couldn't bring herself to send them. Instead, she placed the letters in a drawer, unsure of what to do next. The next time Daniel visited, he noticed the change in her demeanor. "Something's on your mind," he said, his tone gentle. Helen hesitated, then confessed about the letters. "I just don't know if it would make any difference," she admitted. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on hers. "Maybe it's time they're reminded of what they've been taking for granted," he said. Helen nodded, though uncertainty still gnawed at her. Little did she know, events were already in motion that would change everything, for better or worse. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Helen made her decision. The letters she had agonized over for days were sealed and addressed. With trembling hands, she placed them in her mailbox, whispering a silent prayer that her words would reach her children's hearts. For days, Helen heard nothing. The silence felt heavier than before, and doubts began to creep in. Had she overstepped? Would they see the letters as an intrusion? She busied herself with small tasks to distract her mind, but the waiting was unbearable. Then on the 5th day, her phone rang. It was Laura. "Mom," Laura began, her voice hesitant. I got your letter." Helen's heart pounded. "And," there was a long pause, "I didn't realize how much I've been neglecting you." "I'm so sorry, Mom. I've been so caught up in everything. Work, the kids. But that's no excuse. I want to come over this weekend, if that's okay." Tears welled up in Helen's eyes. "Of course, Laura. I'd love that." The next call came from Sarah, who was equally remorseful. "I feel awful, Mom," she admitted. "Reading your letter made me realize how selfish I've been. I'll make time to see you. I promise." Michael sent a text message instead, short but sincere. "Mom, thank you for the letter. I'll call you tonight. Love you." But there was no word from David. Days turned into weeks, and while Helen cherished the renewed connections with her other children, the absence of a response from David was a wound that refused to heal. She tried calling him, but his number was no longer in service. She sent emails, only to receive no reply. "Maybe he's just busy," Helen told Daniel one afternoon as they sat in the garden. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Busy is an excuse, Helen. He should have the decency to respond." Helen sighed, staring at the patch of daffodils they had planted. "I've done all I can. I can't force him to care." Daniel didn't respond, but the frustration on his face was clear. Then, one evening, Helen received an unexpected knock at her door. When she opened it, she was shocked to see David standing there. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and he looked disheveled, as though he hadn't slept in days. "David," Helen said, her voice trembling, "what's wrong?" He hesitated, then stepped inside. "I got your letter, Mom," he said, his voice strained. "And I owe you an apology." Helen led him to the living room, her heart racing. "What happened?" David took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "I've been struggling, Mom. Financially, emotionally, everything's been falling apart. I didn't know how to face you. I felt like such a failure." Helen reached out, placing a comforting hand on his. "Oh, David, you're my son. You don't have to face anything alone." David's eyes filled with tears. "I should have come to you sooner. Instead, I avoided you and I let my pride get in the way. They talked late into the night, and for the first time in years, Helen felt a glimmer of hope for her relationship with her youngest son. But as Helen drifted to sleep that night, content that her family was finally coming together, Daniel was awake, pacing his small apartment. Something about David didn't sit right with him. The next day, Helen received a call from Laura. "Mom, I just got off the phone with Michael. He says David's been asking about your finances." Helen frowned. "My finances? Why would he be interested in that?" Laura's voice lowered. "I don't know, but Michael thinks it's strange. He said David mentioned something about the house and your will." Helen's chest tightened. "That doesn't sound like David. He's been going through a rough time, but he wouldn't—" Laura interrupted gently. "Just be careful, Mom. We all love you, and we don't want anyone taking advantage of you." Helen hung up, her mind racing. She didn't want to believe her son could have ulterior motives, but the seed of doubt had been planted. When Daniel came by later that afternoon, she confided in him. His reaction was immediate and sharp. "Helen, you need to protect yourself. If there's even a chance he's after your money, you have to be cautious." Helen shook her head. "He's my son, Daniel. I can't believe he'd do something like that." Daniel leaned forward, his expression intense. "I understand, but you've been hurt before. Just promise me you'll be careful." Helen nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She didn't know whom to trust anymore. As the days passed, David's behavior became more erratic. He visited often, asking probing questions about Helen's finances and her will. When she hesitated to answer, he grew agitated, even accusing her of favoring the other children. One night, as Helen lay in bed, her mind swirling with doubts, she resolved to take action. She needed to confront David and to make sure her legacy was in safe hands. Unbeknownst to her, Daniel was already taking steps of his own, determined to ensure Helen's safety at any cost. The tension in Helen's home was palpable. David's frequent visits had become a source of anxiety, and while Helen longed to trust her son, the unease in her heart grew with every interaction. She decided to take control of the situation. One evening, after David left in a hurry, following another argument about her will, Helen called a family meeting. Michael, Laura, and Sarah arrived the next day, each bringing their concern and suspicion. Daniel, sensing the gravity of the situation, stayed close by to offer support. As the family gathered in the living room, Helen stood before them, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "I've invited you all here to talk openly and honestly," she began. "There's been too much distance between us for far too long, and I won't let that continue. Not now, not ever." Her gaze shifted to David, whose expression flickered with unease. "David," she said softly, "I need you to tell me the truth. Why have you been so interested in my finances?" David's face turned red. "I told you, Mom. I was just worried about you. You're getting older, and I thought it was time we talked about, the future." Michael interjected, his tone sharp. "The future? Or your future, David? Because it sounds like you've been more concerned with Mom's will than her well-being." David shot him a glare. "You don't understand. I'm drowning in debt. My business failed, and I've got creditors breathing down my neck. I didn't want to bother anyone. But when I got Mom's letter, it felt like she wanted to help us reconnect. I thought maybe she'd—" Helen held up a hand, silencing him. "David, I love you, and I want to help you. But manipulating me or pushing for details about my will isn't the way to do it. If you needed help, all you had to do was ask, not scheme." David's shoulders slumped, his bravado crumbling. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just so desperate." The room was silent for a moment before Helen spoke again, her tone softer. "We all make mistakes, David. What matters is that we learn from them. But I need you to understand something. My will is about more than money. It's about ensuring that the people who care about me and have supported me are taken care of, just as they've cared for me." She turned to the others. "I've already updated my will, and yes, all of you are included. But there's one more name on the list." The siblings exchanged confused glances as Helen walked over to the kitchen door and called out, "Daniel, would you come in, please?" Daniel entered hesitantly, his usual quiet confidence tempered by the gravity of the moment. "Daniel isn't just a friend," Helen said. "He's been there for me when no one else was. He's fixed my home, listened to me, and reminded me what it means to feel valued. I've named him in my will, not for money, but for a special responsibility." Everyone listened intently as she continued. "Daniel will be the one to oversee my final wishes. He's earned my trust, and I know he'll make sure everything is done fairly." David's face darkened. "You trust him more than your own son?" "I trust the person who's shown me love and respect when I needed it most," Helen replied firmly. "David, I want you to be part of my life, but only if you can respect me and those I choose to care about." The words hung in the air, and for once David seemed to understand the depth of her disappointment. In the weeks that followed, things began to change. David sought help for his financial troubles and made an effort to rebuild his relationship with Helen. Michael, Laura, and Sarah visited more frequently, making up for lost time. And Helen, for the first time in years, felt surrounded by love. But the strongest bond was between Helen and Daniel. They remained close friends, their connection a testament to the power of kindness and trust. As for Helen's will, it became less about material wealth and more about the legacy she wanted to leave behind. A reminder to her children and to herself that love was the most valuable gift of all. Thank you for watching this heartfelt story about family, trust, and second chances. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to Stories of Brilliance for more stories that inspire and captivate. Turn on notifications so you never miss our latest uploads.